Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and this is going to be your race weekend preview for F1 in Austria. Today's episode will be a pretty quick one because we're just going to go through the history of the track, some basics of the track, what happened the last time we were here, and of course, some headlines heading into the race weekend that you should be aware of. The Austria Spielberg circuit is known as the Red Bull Ring. However, the track that we know it as today is not how it's always been run. The first Grand Prix happened here in 1970, but in 1996, the track was redesigned in order to be a more modern racetrack. The new racetrack at that point was known as the A1 circuit, and 1997 was the first year that we raced on the track as we know it today. That year, Jacques Villeneuve won the Grand Prix. This track has 10 turns and 3 DRS zones, meaning that we will see some overtaking happen. This circuit is 4.326 kilometers, and we run it for 71 laps. That means that the race itself from start to finish is 306.58 kilometers total. The current lap record at this track is held by Carlos Sainz, and he set that record in 2020. His record lap time is a 105.619. Last year at this circuit, Max Verstappen took pole position. However, George Russell won the race. Max led the race for a majority of time. However, he and Lando Norris collided, dropping them both further back down the order and neither of them sitting on the podium for the race and opening the window for George Russell to take that win. Last time we were here, we also had a sprint race weekend. Pole and win went to Max Verstappen, but we are not going to have a sprint race this weekend. Instead, we will have a standard Grand Prix weekend with 3 free practice sessions, qualifying, and of course the Grand Prix. A couple of important headlines as we head into this race. At the end of this race weekend, 2 of Max Verstappen's 11 penalty points will fall off of his super license. While he still will have 9 penalty points, this will kind of take him off of the bubble. Right now, at 11 penalty points, he is just 1 penalty point away from a mandatory race ban. If you're new to the sport, the penalty point system works like this. If any driver receives 12 penalty points within a 12-month period, they receive an automatic 1 race suspension. Penalty points do not expire with the season. Instead, they stay with you for exactly 12 months from when you received them. So penalty points that you earn at any point in the season could affect you next season up to a 12-month period. This penalty point system was put into place in 2014. Only one driver has ever received a race ban under this penalty point system, and that driver was Kevin Magnussen last year in 2024. If you'd like to know more about the penalty point system, a couple of weeks ago I did an episode entirely on Max Verstappen's penalty points, how he got to this point, how the penalty point system works, and what we did before we had the penalty point system. If you scroll back, you can find that now. At Media Day today, Max Verstappen made it very clear he has no interest in answering questions about these penalty points, and as long as he has a pretty clean and standard race weekend, he should be fine for the remainder of the season. Obviously, even though 2 points are about to fall off, he will still have those 9 other points to contend with, but 3 penalty points are much harder to come by than just a single penalty point. Additionally, in relation to the penalty point system as well as penalty points in general, for the first time ever, the FIA has put out a document about the stewards' guidelines. These guidelines are the guidelines that are given to the stewards by the FIA in order for them to decide how penalties should be awarded and when someone should be at fault. These 2 documents, which you can see on the FIA website, list around 100 different infringements that a driver can receive, as well as the penalties that they should receive for that. This pretty clearly, based on the way the FIA released it and the statement that they gave with it, was released in order to combat some of these questions about transparency. Because fans and the general public do not see these types of documents, the idea is that by sharing this with the public, hopefully you can start to see why certain things are being penalized and others aren't. I would assume that there is a level of trying to get rid of this idea of bias against certain drivers and not against others, why penalties are harsher for some drivers than others, and also, of course, this has been a topic of conversation given the status of Max Verstappen's penalty points. Should anyone receive a race ban due to receiving 12 penalty points in a 12-month period, the team would be allowed to replace that driver with their reserve driver on the grid. Personally, I think it's kind of interesting that the FIA has decided to release a document that in no uncertain terms kind of spells these things out, because very frequently we have these conversations about whether or not a penalty should have been awarded in a way, whether or not there is a bias against certain drivers from certain countries or different teams, whether certain drivers are favored by the FIA or other drivers are not, and also whether or not something should be a penalty. It's an interesting document to be able to go through yourself because for the first time we can actually see all of that information. These are, of course, guidelines, and the stewards always have their ability to make their choices based off of those guidelines, but potentially with these guidelines being released to the public, you may see further scrutiny by fans and teams about specific penalties that are given to drivers during race weekends. Whether or not this clears up the transparency issue, I do think this is actually an interesting document to be able to go through, and I think this gets us a little closer to other sports where you have really clear understandings of how fouls work. Football, American football, basketball, hockey, all of those sports have really clear indications of what a foul is and what the penalty for it would be. I think about hockey in particular because there are certain types of physicality that are allowed and other types of physicality that are not allowed. And it's very clear in the rulebook to all players, coaches, and fans what those infractions are. And additionally, there are like levels of penalties in hockey. You go to the penalty box for 2 minutes for a minor infraction or 5 minutes for a major, like fighting, exciting, but you can also get 10-minute misconduct penalties. And all of those levels are pretty clear to everybody involved in the sport. Formula One penalties have been very different than that. There is very frequently a question as to whether something should have been penalized as harshly as it was or not harshly enough, whether something was a penalty or wasn't a penalty, and being able to read those documents give us a little bit better of an idea as to why certain things happen the way that they do. So if you'd like to go through both of those documents, one of which is about 11 pages, you can actually find that on the FIA website now and go through it yourself. And if people would be interested in me breaking it down, I could consider doing a video on that specifically. Feel free to let me know if that's the case, and if there's enough interest, I will do so. And one last piece of FIA related news, Carlos Sainz Sr. announced that he is ending his bid for the FIA presidency. He had formally announced his interest in running for the FIA presidency back in May, but this weekend he ended that bid, saying that present circumstances are not ideal for him to start his candidacy. His full statement was as follows: "This message is to publicly confirm that I have finally decided not to run for the presidency of the FIA in this year's election. I have worked hard these past few months to understand the depth of the situation at the FIA and the demands and complexities that come with such an important project. After a thoughtful reflection, I have come to the conclusion that the present circumstances are not ideal to set the grounds for my candidacy. Furthermore, I have realized that properly running for president would notably compromise my preparation for Dakar, and I do not wish to weaken my commitment to Ford and my team. These concerns have therefore inclined me to be realistic and desist from any FIA endeavor for now. Despite stepping down from this race, my passion for serving and leading within the motorsport world hasn't changed, and I still believe the organization needs important changes, which I remain genuinely hopeful for that will be tackled in the upcoming years. Both racing and mobility have been my life, and I will closely follow future developments with great interest. I will always support my sport and try to contribute in all meaningful ways to improve mobility for road users around the world. Finally, I want to sincerely thank you all for the messages of support, encouragement, and advice I have received during the past few weeks. They have reinforced my confidence to continue striving towards my present and future goals, and I am truly grateful." Carlos Sainz Sr. giving up this presidency bid does mean that Ben Sulayem, who is the current president of the FIA, looks set to run unopposed. There has been a lot of conversation about whether or not he is the right fit, and whether or not the perceived changes that the FIA needs to make would be made under his presidency continuing. And if you're not familiar with other motorsports, the Dakar Rally, which is what was referenced in Carlos Sainz Sr.'s statement, is one of the most intense races and Carlos Sainz Sr.'s sort of baby. And so not being able to kind of prepare for that race properly, which is very intense, does make sense as to why he would feel he needs to move on from this presidency bid. The question does remain what the state of the FIA will look like with the same president at the helm, and we will just have to wait to find out whether or not that is the case and whether or not Carlos Sainz Sr. eventually runs for presidency again. Another interesting piece of leadership news, Sebastian Vettel did confirm this week that he has been talking to Helmut Marko about a position returning to Red Bull. Most likely this would be in an advisory standpoint, and it would be very cool to see him return. Another piece of not exactly race-related news, in celebration of the F1 movie coming out this week, Brad Pitt actually drove Lando Norris's 2023 McLaren at COTA. COTA stands for the Circuit of the Americas, and it is the racetrack that we have in Austin, Texas. Brad Pitt reported that he got the car up to a top speed of 197 miles per hour, which devastatingly for him was 3 miles an hour shy of what he was hoping to get out of the car. There seems to be no shortage of promotional activities for the F1 movie as it rolls out into theaters this week, and if you'd like to hear my review on the movie, you can go back just to the episode before this one. I had a chance to see it early thanks to Warner Brothers and Apple Original Films, and I made sure to get all of my thoughts out for you in Monday's episode. In race-related news that we should be watching out for as we hit the track, obviously Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri's battle for the World Drivers' title is starting to heat up. Last race in Canada, we saw Lando Norris end his own race by colliding with Oscar Piastri, and a couple of conversation points out of that, Lando did say that the conversations were not exactly fun, but that the team has said that they are both free to race as they continue for this Drivers' Championship title, and Lando did acknowledge that he does believe that he has made more mistakes than Oscar has. As we head into this race, I am curious to see how both of them attack track, and whether Lando can not only start making less mistakes, but potentially force mistakes out of his teammate. Because since Lando came home with no points last week, Oscar sits in first place at 198 points, and Lando is trailing behind at 176. So if he would like to pass Oscar, not only does he have to stop making mistakes, he has to start outperforming Oscar consistently. Personally, as I've said, I do think that we are starting to see him understand what he's doing wrong, and last week's performance felt to me like a removal of this timidness that he currently has. I think Lando and Oscar are both great drivers, and I do feel like one of them is going to end up being the champion this year, and without much doubt, McLaren will take home a second constructors title. However, the question will be which of these two drivers do we see moving forward, and if we see another incident like we did in Canada, will we see McLaren institute some sort of guidelines that are a little bit more stringent? For now, they have such a comfortable berth that it makes sense to let them race this out and really see which of these two drivers can show that they earned the championship out of the two of them. I'm very excited to see the rest of this season because we have two incredibly good drivers in the best car on track. And the real question is, if they are both battling out in such an intense way, which of them comes out on top? Another thing to look out for, Ferrari is bringing upgrades to this race. However, However, we've already seen Lewis Hamilton say that while he's happy that they are bringing upgrades and that he is the team for making them possible, they don't really know how it will affect performance and whether or not it will be a good thing. And that sentiment doesn't make you feel exceptional, especially when Charles Leclerc said that in the simulations for the 2026 car, he did not enjoy driving it. And if they don't see some changes made between now and the next season, he will not enjoy driving the car next year. Ferrari seems to be in a bit of a downward spiral when it comes to the performance of this car, and if the conversation is anything to go by, next year might be a tough one too. Overall, it is a tough thing to watch, and my question each week continues to be more and more whether or not Lewis Hamilton should have stayed at Mercedes. Objectively, going to Ferrari is one of those moves that I think anyone would do, and obviously the package of the deal was a great one, but it is tough to watch Mercedes have consistently better performance, especially with last weekend having a win and a double podium, making Kimi Antonelli the third youngest driver to hit a podium in his Formula One career, and to see the confidence that they seem to have in their car for next year. So Ferrari fans are going to potentially continue to have a couple of years of drought, unless we see that these upgrades really make a difference this weekend, which we won't consistently know until qualifying, though we'll get a peek of it at those 3 free practice sessions that come before that. At Mercedes, we're still waiting to see whether or not George Russell's contract will be renewed and publicly confirmed, and of course we have a number of rumors floating around about those 2 Cadillac seats. Valtteri Bottas posted a video kind of teasing at him getting that Cadillac seat, though we also know he loves to make a good joke. And lastly, one of the major things to look at going into the race this weekend is that Franco Colapinto is going into his 5th race of his 5 races that were guaranteed by this contract that he has. We know this because even in the social media posts that they posted when Franco was announced to replace Jack Doohan, it was stated that his contract was only for 5 races. While it's possible that he will be renewed past that, this is a clear decision point as to whether or not Franco Colapinto will continue in that Alpine seat. And if not, the question would be, is Jack Doohan returning to that seat, or are they testing a 3rd driver in that seat? Most likely, I think we will see them stick with Franco Colapinto or Jack Doohan, given the fact that there is not an unlimited number of driver swaps that a Formula One team can make in a single season. The question will just be which of these 2 drivers remains in their seat. Franco has not had a particularly stunning 5 races, but Jack Doohan also did not have a particularly stunning start to the season. So the question is, do we extend Franco and see if he can have more performance, or do we bring back Jack knowing what the top of his performance is? My gut says that they're going to stick with Franco, especially given how much sponsorship money he brings to the team, but it is always tough to say. So that wraps up your race preview for the Austrian Grand Prix. If you have any questions, you can always leave those in the comments of this episode on YouTube, or you can find me on social media at Marissa Kumari. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Tumblr, YouTube, Threads, Snapchat. You can find me pretty much anywhere you get your internet. You can send your questions in on any of those platforms, or you can always join our Grid Chat Discord server. In the Grid Chat Discord server, we watch the race live together, and it's a really fun way to interact with each other and have a fun way to watch the race not by yourself. You can find the link to all of those things in the episode description down below, and I'll be back on Monday to recap the Austrian Grand Prix.